Want to learn about public policy with a group of curious fellow learners? Apply for the 12-week graduate certificate in public policy. Early bird deadline closes 27th July.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
This is part 2 of a two-part series on Indira Gandhi's complex legacy. The first part of this series was released yesterday. I hope you enjoyed listening to it, and I hope you enjoy listening to the second part of this two-part series. Now talking about another of these domestic causes or conditions, right? How important were these student agitations? How important was the awakening among students? There were, I guess, student agitations right throughout 1960s. Did that have an impact, and how big was that impact? And also, I guess, with the changing voting percentages and vote shares, etc., it also shows that there was an increasing understanding among the people of India that this is one power that they have, the voting rights that they have, and that could bring about changes. So how big an impact did that have in whatever transpired?
So, see, students have always been an important feature in Indian politics, or at least modern Indian politics, as it came to be constituted in the 20th century, right? I mean, students took part in the non-cooperation movement led by M.K. Gandhi in the period after the First World War. They were important in the civil disobedience movement in the 1930s. They were important in the Quit India movement of the 1940s. Students were also quite prominent in the various kinds of movements for creation of linguistic states across various parts of India. Right. So it is not as if the presence and participation of students was something novel in the politics of the 1970s. But what was different was the scale of student participation and mobilization and their own consciousness of themselves as a separate social political force and having a sense of agency that they had. Now, this was for a variety of reasons, because of the extraordinary expansion of tertiary education. You had many more students across campuses in India in the 1960s, which is also true globally, right? I mean, so as you correctly said, historians refer to this moment as a global 1968, right? 1968 is a year when you had student revolts across 67, 68. You see student revolts across the world for a variety of reasons, some of which were common, like the opposition to the Vietnam War, but others were specific, like the context of the civil rights movement in the United States, etc., right? But you see this happening everywhere. China has its Cultural Revolution, which is again pretty much a movement of the youth against the established structures of power, etc. And India has its own counterpart, which is the sort of student support for the Naxalite revolt, which happens in 1967, and the beginnings of the Naxalbari movement, right? I mean, so that becomes a major way in which student kind of involvement in radical politics comes to the fore. But organized student politics also tends to get quite militant throughout this period, right? And again, it's worth noting that in the context of what happens in 1973 in Gujarat and 74 in Bihar, both of which are the precursors to the movement which is then given leadership by Jayaprakash Narayan, which is called the Navnirman movement, are led by students. And their sort of demands are fundamentally shaped by the economic crisis that we discussed, the oil shocks and the inflationary shock which Indian economy was experiencing. So the initial demands are more to do with economic sort of things, which then, because of the refusal of the powers that be to concede anything, then take on a political character. Then there is, confrontation on the streets. There is escalation of protests. So that is how the cycle of agitation and demands and protests really starts taking up. And so to that extent, I think students were a very important force. They were the ones who requested Jayaprakash Narayan to take leadership of this movement and to take it forward. But at the same time, I think it is fair to say that student politics is by definition somewhat transient in its impact, because student generations only last as long as a college sort of term lasts, which is a 3 to 4 year period. Then, of course, there is a successive turnover of leadership, even when there are older student leaders who hang on for longer in order to consolidate various kinds of things. They seldom can have that kind of an impact unless and until they end up joining the sort of organized political parties, which is what happens in the Indian context as well. So if you look at the student sort of leadership of the mid 1970s, the period running up to the emergency, uh, that includes the who's who of Indian politics as it comes to be constituted later, right? I mean, so for instance, you had both Lalu Prasad Yadav and Nitish Kumar, who were student leaders from Bihar. You had Arun Jaitley, who was later Finance Minister of India, who was the president of the Delhi Union Students' Union. And even from the other side, which is to say the Congress Party, which had its own youth Congress, which under the kind of leadership, so to speak, of Sanjay Gandhi, brought in a lot of new political sort of faces into the Congress Party, many of whom continue to be important in the party sort of politics even today. So the emergence of these students as autonomous social actors was a very important phenomenon. But what we also see is the limitations of that kind of politics and the subsumption of that kind of politics by the organized political parties, and then the channeling of the important student leaders and their careers through the political system itself.
Right, right. It's interesting, the student politics, because we were seeing that right now. We saw that recently in Bangladesh also. So in that sense, it's very interesting. Now moving to some of the other international pressures. So you talked about the oil price shock, oil price issue, the dollar issue. But what were some other international pressures and geopolitical considerations, like say for example, strained Indo-US relations or a hurtle towards the Soviet Union, the Cold War context? How did those have an impact on Indira Gandhi's economic and foreign policy decisions? So, and how would you characterize it in terms of realist versus non-aligned sort of moralist sort of movements? Maybe how would you characterize them?
Well, I mean, again, the in terms of the international sort of dimension of this, right? I mean, in some ways, 1971 is a inflection point, because when the Bangladesh crisis happens, the military regime in Pakistan under General Yahya Khan is supported very strongly by the US administration under Richard Nixon. And Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, are using Pakistan to reach out to Maoist China, which is a secret kind of an opening to China, which is kept secret even from their own bureaucracy. So by the time all of this comes out in the open in July 1971, the Indians feel that there is a sort of a nexus which is emerging between US, China, and Pakistan, which in the context of the Bangladesh crisis is going to be quite problematic for India. It is in that context that the Indians actually reach out to the Soviet Union and they conclude an agreement of peace and friendship in treaty in August 1971. But as I show in the book, it is interesting that as late as November 1971, only a few days before the war begins, the Soviet Union is actually somewhat reluctant to support any move by India to militarily resolve the crisis in Pakistan, in East Pakistan, which is Bangladesh. And the Soviet Union actually keeps telling India, including when Mrs. Gandhi goes to Moscow in October 1971, the Soviet leadership led by Brezhnev, Podgorny, and Kosygin tell her quite clearly that that they would rather that India not resort to war in order to resolve this problem. But once it becomes clear that the situation is irretrievable and that a war is going to be imminently happening, then the Soviet Union comes to India's kind of side and vetoes a couple of resolutions in the UN Security Council to impose a ceasefire upon India. But even then, the Soviet sort of angle, while as important as it was for India, was not something that the Indians could entirely take for granted. So what I would say is that, Indira Gandhi's decision to sign this agreement, which in a sense is the most clear repudiation of the doctrine of non-alignment, because it comes as close to saying that we are not in a formal alliance, but at least have a understanding of security kind of challenges, etc., is done once again in the context of the geopolitics of the time. And it's once again illustrative of the broader trend that I was trying to emphasize right at the beginning of our conversation, which is that even though Indira Gandhi sought to sort of, remain, to keep India non-aligned and, continue to sort of be a, important kind of spokesperson for the non-aligned movement, etc., there was realpolitik pressures of geopolitics of the moment which are made for this kind of realignment. And again, Indira Gandhi knew that she could not afford a continually hostile relationship with the United States, but found it very difficult to establish anything like a working relationship with the US until 1980 when she came back to power, and then you had Richard Nixon, who was a conservative kind of political figure who comes to the White House. And it is in the Nixon period that there are some tentative measures at rapprochement between India and the United States, which is then taken forward under her successor, Rajiv Gandhi. Now, the relationship with the Soviet Union, similarly, after her exit from power in 1977, the Soviet Union does not really kind of, reach out to her or offer any kind of support. And it's only when she comes back to power. But at that point of time in 1980, it is the Soviet Union which needs more support from India, because the Soviet Union has just invaded Afghanistan. And once again, Indira Gandhi is, while she publicly refuses to criticize or vote against the Soviet Union in the United Nations, in private, she is very clear with the Soviet leadership that this is not a sustainable sort of model that they have adopted, which is a long-term occupation of Afghanistan, and that they will have to find a way of getting themselves out of that situation. So, yes, you could say that Indira Gandhi was a realist in international politics, in the same sense in which she was a realist in domestic politics, in a sense that she felt that power political considerations were important. Again, I think that contrasting it with the idealism of her father, etc., is perhaps mistaken, because her father himself has a kind of a record of thinking about and using force and an appreciation of the realist dimensions of international politics, which is perhaps underappreciated by scholars of international relations. But so I don't think that particular comparison holds. But it is certainly the case that during her time, the overarching focus on securing India, particularly making sure that India remains stable and impervious to external sort of pressures, etc., was a very important priority for her.
Right, and I guess that's why there's a nuance to how we should really study Indira Gandhi or that period, right? I wanted to just maybe drill a little bit into the mixed economic legacy of Indira Gandhi's tenure, especially from the 1970s onwards. Just wanted to explore what was the continuum till say 1984, till her death, in terms of the pro-market or pro-business sort of policies that she might have put into place, and what was the impact of those decisions even now?
Yeah, so I mean, again, a range of economists and other scholars have suggested that Indira Gandhi, when she came back to power for the last time in 1980, initiated a pro-business tilt, so to speak, which is then sought to be differentiated from a pro-market tilt. Now, again, I mean, I think those kinds of distinctions only stand on this idealized assumption of what operating market-based economy is, without taking into account the real power structures that operate in any political economic system of this nature, right? I mean, so I think the distinction between a pro-business and a pro-market one is kind of a distinction without a difference. But nevertheless, my own researchers have shown that this kind of a pro-business tilt goes back at least to 1975. Which is the period soon after the economic sort of shocks which impact her, and she abandons all of the sort of much more statist and leftist kind of political measures that have been put into place in the early 1970s, and then moves towards a much more pro-business kind of thing. In fact, I think that is what is then continuing through the period. But again, I would say that it might be incorrect to say that in some ways the process of liberalization of the Indian economy, in the sense in which 1991 happened, was somehow begun at a time. As I said, I mean, the process was one which took a while. There was a consensus which started building within the system on the imperatives of moving towards. But nevertheless, 1991 was a regime change, in a sense that a new kind of economic orientation, especially towards a global economy, was ushered in 1991, which makes it a very distinctive moment. And that needs to be understood in its own terms. My only point is that the pro-business tilt itself certainly can be dated back to the period of the emergency and thereafter. And that continues. Now, as I said, the other very important legacy that she left behind, and perhaps the most lasting and visible legacy into our own times, is the kind of Indian state's imagination about what constitutes development, right? I mean, in the Nehruvian period, there was a sense that development effectively was the structural transformation of an agrarian economy into an economy with significant quantum of heavy industries and other capacities for production beyond the agrarian realm, right? I mean, so there was a structural transformation story which was there, and that was generally thought to be the best way to, improve the incomes of various people down the economic chain, and how to sort of improve their economic efficiency, their ability to contribute more, and how to decrease relative inequality, etc. But under Indira Gandhi, particularly in her time, I think there was a new kind of a focus that the Indian state develops, which is, as I said earlier, on targeted welfare measures which are aimed at particular sections of society, right? So those kinds of various kinds of state led schemes of aid and subsidy for particular groups for particular requirements is something that is highly visible in Indian political economy even today. I mean, you just need to open the newspaper of any day and look at the news from any state, let alone the sort of national or the union government level. And what dominates Indian politics pretty much is avowal of various kinds of schemes, right? I mean, so if you just travel across most states in India, you will find that there is a huge photo of the chief minister with a list of schemes and the list of various kinds of benefiting social groups, which is laid out all across the place. I mean, so that has become the default imagination of the Indian state as far as economic development is concerned. And whether we agree or disagree with that model, and I would respectfully say that I do disagree with that particular focus, nevertheless, it has been one of the most important contributions of Indira Gandhi. And again, her imprint that she has left on the Indian state in this dimension remains highly significant even to date.
Right. Wonderful points made about the structure of or the development economics as such, sort of changing when it comes to India. And economics is, I guess, part of the cause behind all such changes that happen in a nation. So this brings me to the last question. It pertains to the emergency period, which I didn't want to, talk about a lot because it's already been discussed a lot. But one angle which probably we can explore is the economic angle behind the declaration of emergency. So we have generally talked about the politics behind emergency getting declared, or the decisions of the judiciary, and they could be the immediate triggers. But was there some economic reason that culminated in the emergency as such? And how much did, and maybe not exactly related, but what role did Indira Gandhi's personal perceptions and antipathies, like say towards the RSS and others, play in shaping these sorts of political decisions during a rule? So two separate questions, but yeah.
Well, I think the best way to answer that question is perhaps to say that, how do we explain the onset of the emergency, right? I mean, what is the best way of thinking about why the emergency happened? Now, at some level, the emergency did happen because Indira Gandhi decided to impose the emergency. That is an undeniable fact. The antecedent question is, why did she do that? And there, I think we can kind of point quite legitimately to the fact that the Allahabad High Court's decision on 12th of June 1975 to set aside her election to the Lok Sabha in 1971 posed a grave threat to her continuation in office, even though the Supreme Court gave her a conditional stay thereafter. But she still decided that in order to secure her position, she needed to take extraordinary powers into her hand and to put much of the opposition which was hitting the streets demanding her resignation into jail. So the immediate trigger for the emergency is very much this kind of event, which was the Allahabad High Court verdict of June 1975. But I do not believe that just focusing on Indira Gandhi's intentions and what she wanted to do at that moment is enough to explain why the emergency happened. We also need to ask ourselves, how was it possible, even if Indira Gandhi wanted to assume such powers, that she could just take it away at a stroke of a pen, right? What was it about the political system that enabled her to actually take these kinds of steps? And there, the broader political systemic transformations that I spoke about earlier are the first most important cause, which is that the political system had already, by the time the emergency was imposed, become one where there was an extraordinary concentration of power in the office of the prime minister. She was powerful vis-a-vis her party. Given her party's majority in parliament, she was powerful in parliament. Given her party's dominance across states, she was powerful in the Rajya Sabha, but also in terms of getting any constitutional amendment which needed supermajorities passed. And by her decision in 1973 to supersede the two senior-most judges of the Supreme Court of India and to replace them with a more pliable candidate, she had imposed her own sort of stamp upon the judiciary also. So this kind of structural shift in terms of power towards the executive was the first dimension. The second was the derogation of the rules of the game of parliamentary democracy, which had also happened even before. So without these two antecedent political changes happening, it is actually difficult to understand how the prime minister could have wanted to. I mean, I can easily imagine any prime minister wanting to assume all kinds of powers, but will they be allowed to do that by a political system? That is the question. And how was she allowed to do it? It is because these changes had already happened. But these changes themselves do not explain everything, because what you had is the concurrent global economic crisis, which again had independent origins. As I said, those were to do more with decisions taken in the United States or by OPEC countries and others. But the impact that the global economic crisis of 1974 particularly had on the Indian economy, and the subsequent trigger that it gave for all kinds of protests, including a very large, perhaps the largest protest by any organized group in the 20th century, which is the Indian sort of national railway strike of 1974. All of that took place against the backdrop of this global economic crisis, right? So that global economic crisis is also, therefore, an important and you could say conjunctural or coincidental factor, which created the conditions under which the emergency was imposed. Because without those conditions, you would not perhaps had protests of this scale. And if you did not have protests of this scale, then perhaps Indira Gandhi would never have felt that threatened, even if a high court verdict went against her one way. It is because these movements were already surging around for about a year and a half before the Allahabad High Court came, and then these movements got this extraordinary sort of galvanizing effect by the verdict, that she then became so insecure, right? So you see how political system and structure, the economic global conjuncture of the time, and the individual and her insecurities all have to be brought together in order to understand how is it that something like the emergency could be imposed, right? I mean, I think that is a very important point that we need to take. So it is not as if there are economic roots of the emergency, but there are economic factors that played a causal role in the onset of the emergency. That is the way I would say. Now, again, Indira Gandhi's antipathies towards the RSS, etc., are very well established. In fact, even before the emergency is imposed on 25th of June, she wanted in January already to sort of clap on an emergency in order to tackle the RSS, etc., which she felt was becoming very strong in the context of the movement led by Jayaprakash Narayan. And in fact, one of her very close associates, the railway minister, L.N. Mishra, was assassinated in January 75. And she felt that, various kinds of extremist groups, including the RSS, perhaps had a hand in these kinds of occurrences happening. So she was actually quite keen to, clap the RSS into jail, which is one of the first steps that she does as part of the move towards emergency. But again, as I said, her insecurities, whether they are real or imagined, we can debate, right? Because in some sense, she did have imagined insecurities in terms of how groups like the RSS, etc., were raged against her. But then she also had other kinds of real challenges to confront, which is that the opposition parties demanding her resignation after 12 June 1975, right? Which is why I don't think everything can be brought down to Indira Gandhi's paranoia. Indira Gandhi's, one of her antagonists and someone whom she seems to have had a visceral dislike for is Henry Kissinger. Kissinger once said famously that even the paranoid can have real enemies, right? So that's a very important point for us to remember. She may have had her fears and insecurities, but it is the context in which all of that played out that is very important for us to take note of.
Great. Thanks for this wonderful discussion. Your book really updates our understanding of the long 1970s, as you call it, right? And it really explains very well the complexity of her legacy. In fact, it also lays down how context and conditions really change the course of history, so as to say. So, I mean, as you've written in your book, 1964 or something, maybe she was just before Nehru's death, she was thinking of moving abroad to stay with her husband or something of that sort. Not sure. To stay with the kids, I guess. I'm not sure. But from there, events changed, and then we have a different trajectory itself. So that sort of it's very interesting to see how things change. So yeah, thanks for this wonderful discussion. As parting thoughts, any thoughts on what are the pitfalls or what are the signs that India should look for, or in general any country should look for in their political system, in their political life, in our nation's political life, economic life, so as to be able to identify the directions in which we are moving, whether we are straying away from the constitution, constitutional ethos, constitutional morality. Yeah.
Right. I mean, again, Arindam, all I'd say is that those are large kinds of questions which political scientists rather than historians like me are more interested in understanding. Right. I mean, as a historian, my interest is understanding how the past gave way to something like the present, how change happened over a period of time. And all I can say is that if I study this particular period of extraordinary change in Indian political history, which is the long 1970s, the one thing which becomes very clear is that, at the end of the day, the rules of the game of politics as it is constituted, not simply by what is laid down in the constitution, but how through a series of understanding the rules, norms, procedures, we kind of come to structure this particular game and then allow it to be played out iteratively, are a very important part of any organized political activity. And I think we need to pay attention to that, because there is a tendency to sort of constantly insist that politics is a kind of a no holds barred kind of an activity. Why should we even think about restraints, especially voluntary self-imposed restraints, etc.? I think that is a very grievous and wrong understanding of what the nature of politics is. I mean, it is definitely about power, but even the way that power operates in any political system, and it's not just parliamentary democracy, but any political system, even if you want to have a revolutionary politics of a certain kind, it has to be played by certain rules of the game. And that's the only thing that keeps the show going on. So I think instead of just thinking abstractly about what are the kinds of warning signs that we should look for, because I'm pretty sure whatever crisis that whether India or any other country may face in the future, that will be very different from what happened in the past. So the past is not going to give you ready-made lessons. But if there is any one takeaway from having worked on this book, I would say it is an attention to this kind of rules of the game aspect of politics, which we all tend to sort of derogate. Right? I mean, we just look at it. Right? I mean, every attempt to do something which is very clearly seen as wrong is somehow described by our media and pundits as a masterstroke of a certain kind. We seem to revel in the fact that these kinds of norms can be, cast aside by powerful actors, and that, established ways of doing things can be set aside. And somehow that is seen as a sign of political genius in some ways. And I think that is a fundamentally problematic way in which we have come to structure our politics and understand our politics, right? I mean, even in the 1970s, at least there were some voices which used to keep cautioning, saying that, even for someone like Jayaprakash Narayan to suggest that extra parliamentary agitation to get legitimately elected governments out is the right way, even those things used to be questioned. Whereas today, I think, there is the derogation of these rules of the game has happened to such an extent that we actually seem to think that that's the great thing, and in some ways it's a sign of political wisdom, if not of political genius, to operate along those lines, which can only be destructive for a system in the long run. I mean, that is the only point that I would say stuck to me when I sort of studied this period intensively.
Great. Yeah. So play by the rules. Great words to end our podcast on. So thanks, Srinath, for taking time out for this podcast. It was a wonderful discussion. I'm sure our listeners will enjoy it. Thanks.
Thank you, Arindam. Thanks for reading the book and for asking all these interesting questions. It was lovely to be in conversation with you.
Thank you.
This concludes our two-part series on the legacy and times of Indira Gandhi. Hope you enjoyed listening to both the parts. Let us know what you think.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaInst or our website takshashila.org.in.